Joining me now to talk about the state of the tech trade and upcoming earnings from CoreWeave, we've got Dan O'Brien, president of Futurum. Dan, thank you so much for joining us to kick off a new week of trading. Before we get into the expectations for CoreWeave, let's talk about tech sentiment. So we saw a pullback last week after just a monster run this year. From your vantage point, was this that, kind of garden variety profit taking?
I think so. We're certainly getting closer to the end of the year. The infrastructure trade has had a really unprecedented run. I do think that, a pullback was necessary at some point. Listen, I think in the short term, we all know that supply constraints are really dictating kind of revenues, and we're, more than meeting demand. I think investors are really trying to get a sense as to these very large commitments that we're hearing from the hyperscalers, right? This has been all throughout the news the past couple of months. How do those really translate over the next couple of years, right? I think as we look at 2027 consensus, I think there's a lot of kind of credence to the point of view that potentially those are a little bit low as we look at translating some of these large announcements into kind of real capacity plans. But, it's such a complex supply chain we're trying to manage here. I think the constraints have shifted around the supply chain. At times it's been wafers, times it's been packaging. We're hearing a lot in the memory sector right now, spot prices spiking, huge memory requirements coming in. I think that, the AI utility trade has really been the area that's taken off in the most recent weeks. And I think, that's because the supply constraint really seems to be on the power side right now. So I think there's a lot of kind of triangulation going up and down the supply chain as to really where those constraints sit. And, I think that the market's actually doing a pretty good job of kind of not overbuilding on any one component, given we're, not quite sure at any given point what the long pole in the tent is.
I want to dig into that a little bit, kind of, I guess, potential choke points, because, for instance, I'm sure it came across your radar with Nvidia CEO Jensen Huang saying they need more supplies from Taiwan Semi. Exactly. So, where do you see the biggest choke points? Is it the chips and GPUs? Is it the supplies, is it the power, as you mentioned? Where do you see that? Because, again, when I look across the landscape, it seems like the biggest issue is supply, not demand.
Absolutely. I mean, I think we see demand outpacing supply for, at least the next couple of years. It really feels like there's a analysis going on across the market right now to try to figure out, does this cross in 28, 29, 30? I mean, I think the visibility is, viewed to be really good out on the next several years. I think the constraint right now seems to be in and around the power side of things. I think we're really trying to understand kind of what energy we can bring online, where and when. And the supply chain will react very quickly to get the right componentry, the cooling, the chips, the memory, to those places, when that power can come online. But this is a multi-year planning process, and I think we still got to see TSMC convert a lot of this stuff to wafers for the equipment area, the memory area, and the fabless companies to really start to see those out year estimates start to come up a little bit.
Let's talk about your expectations going into CoreWeave. I mean, it's been one of those high flyer new companies. It's operating, obviously, in this space. The last month or so has been bumpy for CoreWeave, though. What's your sense of where things sit now for CoreWeave?
Yeah, down about 20% since the last report. I think, CoreWeave will continue to be a little bit of a volatile stock, which is interesting, right? Because Nvidia has, come out this quarter and, made a deal with them to essentially absorb any unused capacity through to 2032, right? So, again, looking at the number of years that we're kind of planning out here. Listen, we featured them recently in our Futurum signal report, looking at the AI clouds. I mean, they're really, kind of the top of the neo cloud group in terms of being able to compete with the hyperscaler. Partnerships, announcements with OpenAI, many others. I think it's a company we continue to like. In a lot of ways, in terms of being exposed to the right secular trends. I think the market's obviously wrestling with, very high CapEx business, extremely high revenue growth, but, still a loss-making business. How does that really shake out in the long term? I think that's what, investors are really looking to find out a little bit more about tonight on the call.
Okay, speaking of that, yeah, how much attention should be paid on, as you mentioned, the expectation for continual red ink? Like, do you expect Wall Street to still show or to show grace again to CoreWeave, given where they sit in their relationship with these big companies, for instance, like Nvidia? I mean, does Wall Street see that as a strength?
I certainly think that the market will be looking for more of those long-term signals and probably looking past a little bit of the short-term results. I mean, I think we're going to want to look at backlog. We're going to look at how these big commitments that you've seen in the press releases really translate, into out-year revenues. What kind of guide do they give and how far out? Certainly commentary on, the CapEx environment and, any sort of indication as to where the tipping point will be on profitability will be interesting, but I don't necessarily expect it to hear that tonight.
All right, Dan, thank you so much for your time kicking off a new week here with us. That's Dan O'Brien, president of Futurum. Appreciate your insight.